rather be ashes than dust. I would rather that my spark should burn out in a brilliant blaze than it should be stifled by dry rot. I would rather be a superb meteor, every atom of me in magnificent glow, than a sleepy and permanent planet. The proper function of man is to live, not to exist. I shall not waste my days in trying to prolong them. I shall use my time.
Sailor, adventurer, socialist, rancher, war correspondent, author. As a writer, Jack London rivaled Mark Twain in popularity, but his diverse interests and varied talents made him one of the most celebrated personalities in the world.
Jack London liked to present a certain image of himself. I think he needed to have people think that he was doing other things, that he was an adventurer more than he was a writer.
A central thing throughout his work is adventure, the call to adventure. And we all, I think, respond to that call, whether it's adventure in traveling, adventure in sports, or adventures of the mind.
His life was one of constant struggle, but one never lacking in excitement.
And he did largely live a very heroic life, a very exciting life. He almost tried to live a life that, if you look at it now, he was sort of an archetypal hero, and tragic hero too.
I was born in the working class. Early I discovered enthusiasm, ambition, and ideal.
Himself up by his own bootstraps.
You cannot just read him and take him at face value, because he fooled himself to some extent, and I think he played a game with the people around him to some extent. I think he tried very hard to live up to the images he had of his own sense of self.
Jack London was born John Griffith Cheney on January 12, 1876, in San Francisco. His mother, Flora Wellman, was a sometime piano teacher and spiritualist from a proud and wealthy Ohio family. A spinster at age 30, Flora moved west where she met the man presumed to be Jack London's father, an itinerant astrologer named William Henry Cheney.
After Flora became pregnant, she and Cheney had some kind of argument, and he left, and there was this very notorious headline in the San Francisco paper about a pregnant woman shooting herself and trying to kill herself because her lover wanted her to get an abortion.
Flora called herself Mrs. Cheney, but she and the astrologer were never married. A few months after giving birth, Flora married Civil War veteran John London and acquired a wet nurse for the baby, an African-American woman named Virginia Prentice.
And from her and from that family, as I say, I think he got his humanism, his compassion, his sympathy and even empathy for all creatures, not merely people of different cultures, but for animals as well. And that is reflected in his greatest work, that kind of empathy is.
His own mother, according to most accounts, seems to have felt quite cold toward him, may have even felt that she had ruined her life. She was, according to London, not a loving mother.
For comfort, young Jack turned to older stepsister Eliza. She saw to Jack's welfare as the family's finances forced them to move several times during his childhood. Jack's closest companions were his dog, Rollo, and the characters in the books he read.
And he says, early on, if you ask him what were the most important early events in his life, he talks about the books he read. And as the first thing, and the second was moving to Oakland, where he had access to the free public library.
Librarian Ina Coolbrith, also California's first poet laureate, guided and encouraged Jack to read Kipling, Melville, and Irving. He reveled in tales of adventure in faraway places.
I believe from early reading, he began to develop a sense of himself that was in some ways in conflict with his environment and was a kind of escape. In other ways, later on, he was trying to bring his inner life, if you will, his imaginative life, into contact with the social realities in which he grew up and lived as a young man.
By the age of 10, Jack had been working at a number of odd jobs to contribute to the family income. He delivered newspapers, swept out saloons, and set up pins in a bowling alley. At 14, he worked in a local cannery for 12 hours a day at 10 cents an hour.
He was able to set aside a few dollars and buy himself a small boat. And he taught himself how to sail on San Francisco Bay. There's a lot of tides and currents and things that you have to learn about if you're going to survive out there, and he did. He taught himself how to do that.
Then the adventure lust was strong within me. I left home. I didn't run, I just left. Went out into the bay and joined the oyster pirates. The days of the oyster pirates are now past, and if I had got my dues for piracy, I would have been given 500 years in prison.
His days on the Oakland waterfront led him to the Sophia Sutherland, a sealing ship headed for the Bering Sea. 17-year-old Jack London joined the crew and spent 7 months hunting seals. The experience would inspire his first writing.
Flora had noticed an announcement in the San Francisco paper of a contest, and she encouraged him to write something down. It was for a descriptive essay, and he did. And he wrote about his experience of a typhoon off the coast of Japan.
In the sun's path they wandered, where every ripple, great or small, every little spit or spray looked like molten silver, where the water lost its dark green color and became a dazzling silvery flood, only to vanish and become a wild waste of sullen turbulence, each dark, foreboding sea rising and breaking, then rolling on again.
Jack London, with only a grammar school education, triumphed over Stanford and Berkeley graduates. He won the $25 first prize and had his essay published in the San Francisco Morning Call. The economic depression of the 1890s cast a pall over the country. Tramps and hobos littered the landscape as the exploitation of child labor forced many men out of work. Tired of being what he termed a work beast, Jack traveled across the country on foot or aboard freight trains to join a protest for labor rights.
He met these intellectual hobos and was introduced to the philosophy of socialism. So he was beginning to get a sense that he's not the only person who has suffered at, being mistreated in the work, being taken advantage of. He began to realize that there is a social pattern and that there are philosophies that help people understand this.
I think socialism was an ideal for him, and he was never interested in participating in the party politics or in voting or any of the workings of it, but as an ideal of how people could live in harmony that satisfied certain ideas he had about justice.
To further his education, 19-year-old Jack enrolled in Oakland High School, where he also worked part-time as a janitor to support his family. He aspired to go to college, but was too impatient to finish high school. He enrolled in the University Academy and crammed 2 years' worth of studying into 4 months.
I think he truly believed that he was capable of overcoming any and all obstacles if he set his mind to it. He had a strong body and a strong will and an excellent mind.
He was admitted to the University of California at Berkeley, but the family's financial situation forced Jack to drop out after only 1 semester.
I decided immediately to embark on my career. I had 4 preferences. First, music. Second, poetry. Third, the writing of philosophic, economic, and political essays. And fourth and last and least, fiction writing. I resolutely cut out music as impossible, settled down in my bedroom, and tackled my second, third, and fourth choices simultaneously. I wrote everything.
But he didn't know what he was doing. He was trying to copy the stuff he had read in the magazines, most of which was second-rate. I mean, this kind of formula writing of genteel romances. So what he was writing was third or fourth rate. Deservedly, it wasn't published.
Unable to get his writing career off the ground, Jack London instead pursued a life of adventure. He left for the Klondike in July of 1897. He climbed the Chilkoot Pass and spent a year prospecting for gold.
It was in the Klondike that I found myself. There, nobody talks. Everybody thinks. You get your true perspective. I got mine.
He was a great listener. And during that year he was up there, he was listening to the old-timers, the sourdoughs, and the newcomers tell their various tales of what occurred up there. He was absorbing. He was assimilating. And he said, I found myself there. And he came back, and now he had something to write about.
In 1898, Jack London returned from the Klondike to San Francisco with scurvy and $4.50 worth of gold. During his absence, his stepfather, John London, had died. Jack was now head of the family and its sole breadwinner.
But I couldn't get any work, yet I was a bargain in the labor market. I was 22 years old, weighed 165 pounds stripped, every pound of which was excellent for toil. I tackled every opening for employment. I tried to become a studio model, but there were too many fine-bodied young fellows out of jobs.
To make money, Jack sent out stories detailing life in the Alaskan wilderness. He received 44 rejections in the span of 6 months. Then, a small fantasy magazine, The Black Cat, offered $40 to publish his story, 1,000 Deaths. But the most important offer to publish came from the Atlantic Monthly, the most prestigious magazine in the country. They offered Jack $120 for an Odyssey of the North.
Imagine how much money that was. 3 or 4 months' pay in the factory, but more important, to be accepted by the Atlantic Monthly meant that you had made it. You were good enough to publish anything, anytime, anywhere. And shortly after that, Houghton Mifflin contracted with him to publish his first book.
Not content to rest on his laurels, Jack continued his self-education by reading, writing, and developing a voice. He disciplined himself to write 1,000 words a day, a habit that would last him the rest of his life.
The amazing thing about those manuscripts is that you almost never find corrections or changes. You can see occasionally he would go back probably the next day and read the last paragraph he had finished, make a few little changes, and then on he goes.
His thoughts flowed rapidly, so you see a lively mind at work. This is not just writing pro forma. He's getting down complete thoughts, thinking deep things, and getting those down in his writings.
He immersed himself in books by such intellects as Herbert Spencer and Charles Darwin, whose philosophical arguments intrigued him. Jack looked for ways to apply his newly acquired knowledge to his own life.
He also wanted, he said, to marry not for love, but for rational reasons. He talked about wanting to produce healthy Anglo-Saxon boys and girls and wanted to prove that love was an illusion and that romance was, a falsehood.
I made up my mind. Sunday evening, I opened transactions for a wife. By Monday evening, had the affair well underway, and next Saturday morning, I shall marry a Bessie Maddern.
Elizabeth May Maddern, known as Bessie, was a 23-year-old friend and math tutor whose fiancé had recently died. She had also been Jack's tutor when he was in high school.
It's the kind of a thing where it's not going to really be the right marriage, but he jumped into it and proposed to her very suddenly just by watching her set up Flora's apartment with hanging curtains, this type of stuff. And she was lonely, young, and beautiful. She was a very beautiful woman.
Jack and Bess were married on April 7th, 1900, the same day his first novel, The Son of the Wolf, was published. The following year, Bess gave birth to a daughter, Joan. Another woman in Jack's life was Anna Strunsky, a beautiful young Jewish revolutionary he had met at a socialist lecture in 1899.
She was the first woman who was his intellectual equal, and she was also very attractive. Not merely to him, but to other men, but in a very genteel way.
Jack's abrupt marriage to Bessie put an end to their fledgling romance, but they continued their affair of the mind.
Jack and Anna came up with the idea of writing the Kempton Waste letters. And in the process of their sharing manuscripts and working together, his feelings for her revived, and he did ask her to marry him while he was married to Bess, who at that point had a child already.
And he told her, he says, look, this marriage is not working out. Says, I know that I can't be happy with Bessie. Why don't we, I know I love you. I've always loved you. Why don't we just get married and run off to New Zealand or Australia or someplace? And she says, yes, darling, with all my heart.
But Anna soon changed her mind. In a letter to Jack, she accused him of lying about his feelings for her.
When she broke off the relationship, she had just learned that Bess was pregnant again, and he had led her to think that he wasn't having any sex at all with his wife.
Perhaps for reasons not just professional, Jack traveled to England to expose the awful living conditions in East End slums. Disguised as a sailor on leave, he spent months living among and interviewing the poor. He would later describe the people of the abyss as the closest to his heart.
From the slimy sidewalk, they were picking up bits of orange peel, apple skin, and grape stems, and they were eating them. The pits of green-gauge plums they cracked between their teeth for the kernels inside. They picked up stray crumbs of bread the size of peas, apple cores so black and dirty, one would not take them to be apple cores. And these things these two men took into their mouths and chewed them and swallowed them, and this between 6 and 7 o'clock in the evening of August 20, year of our Lord 1902, in the heart of the greatest, wealthiest, and most powerful empire the world has ever seen.
He felt that he wrote two kinds of works. He wrote fiction and he wrote nonfiction. And what he loved was the nonfiction, and that's what he thought was his true writing. And the fiction he wrote to make money. And he was very, very clear about that.
Upon his return from England, Jack had two surprises waiting for him. Bess had given birth to another daughter, Becky, and Macmillan Company offered Jack a contract for 6 books. He began work on a novel of adventure, told from the perspective of a dog.
The domesticated generations fell from him. In vague ways he remembered back to the youth of the breed, to the time the wild dogs ranged in packs through the primeval forest and killed their meat as they ran it down. It was no task for him to learn to fight with cut and slash and the quick wolf snap. In this manner had fought forgotten ancestors. They quickened the old life within him, and the old tricks which they had stamped into the heredity of the breed were his tricks. They came to him without effort or discovery, as though they had been his always.
The Call of the Wild launched him as a literary and popular success because it appealed both to people on its literary merit, and it also appealed to the popular, just to the general public. And he did become exceedingly well known overnight in this country. He was the highest paid author of his time while he was alive.
With fame came notoriety. The success of The Call of the Wild also brought Jack accusations of plagiarism.
To the editor of The Independent, in reply to yours of January 16, by all means, go ahead and publish that article that accuses me of plagiarism of many passages in The Call of the Wild. So far as concerns the source of much of my material in The Call of the Wild, being Egerton R. Young's My Dogs in the Northland, I plead guilty. A couple of years ago, in the course of writing to Mr. Young, I mentioned the same fact and thanked him for the use his book had been to me.
He always stated there are only so many ideas that you can write on, and that you're taking the same idea someone else took, but you improve on it, or you hit it at a different angle.
His newfound success brought Jack some measure of satisfaction. He was able to make a living as a writer and live a life of relative comfort. All that did nothing to improve his situation with Bess.
And she's doing a lot to support the family, and yet at the same time, he's not really recognizing that. She's typing his manuscripts and editing them, and she's tutoring to bring more income into the family.
And poor Bess was just really miscast as a Mrs. Jack London. She was much too serious. She didn't want to enter into his kind of bumptious way of life where he rebounded from one thing to the next. I think she was much more steady, and he needed someone who would go along with him.
In 1903, Jack London began writing a novel about the sea. He created one of his most memorable characters, Wolf Larsen, through whom he was able to voice his own disillusionment with material success.
Cabin boy at 12, ship's boy at 14, ordinary seaman at 16, able seaman at 17, and cock of the forecastle. Infinite ambition and infinite loneliness, receiving neither help nor sympathy. I did it all for myself. Navigation, mathematics, science, literature, and whatnot. And of what use has it been? Master and owner of a ship at the top of my life, as you say, as I am beginning to diminish and die. Paltry, isn't it? And when the sun was up, I was scorched, and because I had no root, I withered away.
And you've got that materialist who, in a sense, represents moments of Jack's own long sickness, when he was so very deeply depressed around 1903 and 1904 when he was composing that novel.
Jack's depression was lifted with a little romance. While writing The Sea Wolf, Jack became better acquainted with 32-year-old Charmian Kittredge.
She'd had a number of affairs, some with married men, and became a good friend of Bess London's, in that Bessie confided in Charmian when Bessie thought that Jack and Anna Strunsky were having an affair. Charmian was her confidant, became a good friend.
Charmian was not really the first woman that he was philandering with, but she was the one who was able to, I think, just appeal to him on so many levels that he was willing to walk away from two young daughters and challenge the mores of the time, which were very much against divorce.
Within a month of their first kiss, the two were madly in love. Their relationship gave Jack the courage to leave Bessie and the children. But it would be 2 years before he and Charmian married, the day after his divorce from Bessie became final. The Sea Wolf became a #1 bestseller. Jack London's popularity was soaring, and he used his growing celebrity to bring attention to the socialist cause. In 1905, he posted an unsuccessful bid for mayor of Oakland on the socialist ticket.
Most of the socialists were pleased to have him out there preaching. He's a major celebrity. It's hard for us to imagine anybody today who can match him in terms of celebrity. I mean, here's a man who was a celebrated writer, he was a celebrated politician, he was a celebrated adventurer, he was a celebrated sportsman. He was a public figure like no one person I can think of today. And the socialists were very happy to have him out there preaching their political point of view.
Anything he did or didn't do but was rumored to have done made the news. And he exploited that absolutely shamelessly because he knew that would sell his books.
He needed money. So, and he wasn't ashamed of it. But he was criticized by the what a classical author should be. For an author to make money, why, that was looked down upon.
If you perceive writers as college-educated gentlemen who write for fun and for their friends, well, to London, that was an outdated and classist view of writing. So that I think he's trying to avoid the idea that writers are somehow removed from the people.
And I think one reason that he's been slow to be acknowledged as a major figure in our canon is that he didn't have the right friends in literary circles. Unlike Mark Twain, Jack didn't have William Dean Howells to promote his works among the literary elite or what have you.
He was illegitimate, he was working class, he was a socialist. It all works against the idea that we have of a successful writer, of someone like Edith Wharton or Henry James.
In 1905, Jack and Charmian decided to spend 7 years sailing around the world. Jack called upon his publishers for several $1,000s in advances and immediately set about building their boat, which they named the Snark.
The Snark was built right after the earthquake and fire in San Francisco in 1906, which meant that the price of lumber, the price of labor had skyrocketed because of the rebuilding that was going on in San Francisco. So the boat was way over his budget.
But he's also an artist, and he had his wants, and if he lived today, he'd probably have his credit cards right up to the hilt. I mean, that's the way he was. But he also felt that he had the ability to make the money, so he could afford to go into that type debt.
On April 23, 1907, Jack and Charmian, along with 4 novice sailors, set sail from San Francisco Bay.
They get out, just out the bay, and immediately the engine doesn't work. It's evident that things are going badly, but he didn't turn around. And he did teach himself that skill of navigation, and he got the boat to Hawaii, and then from there on to the South Sea Island.
Jack chronicled his adventures for Cosmopolitan and Women's Home Companion. These installments were later published as The Cruise of the Snark. The Londons traveled to remote islands, the Marquesas, Tahiti, Samoa, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands. Jack London brought to the American public stories of cannibals in the Solomon Islands and of lepers on Molokai from their perspective.
He was not a cultural anthropologist. He didn't go out with notebook in hand and really study other cultures. But he was quick and imaginative and identified with those indigenous peoples.
Though Jack and Charmian had planned to spend 7 years on their journey, they were forced to cut the voyage short after only 2. Jack suffered from a number of tropical illnesses and spent 5 months recovering in Australia.
There were these sores that he got in the Solomon Islands called yaws. He treated them with what was thought to be a good treatment, which was mercury. But the dosage, by the time he ended up in the hospital in Australia, no one really knew how much mercury he had used.
Jack and Charmian London returned home from their South Sea adventures in the spring of 1909. During the Snark voyage, Jack had continued writing his 1,000 words a day. He completed 3 books and nearly 30 short stories.
So in terms of subject matter, his career was tremendously enhanced, I think. But he paid a terrible price in terms of his physical health because of it.
Once back in California, Jack recovered quickly. He spent his time in Glen Ellen, where he and Charmian had purchased some land. Their beauty ranch, encompassing more than 1,000 acres in Sonoma County, was Jack's next big project.
He wanted to be a responsible rancher and farmer, one who did not exploit the land, but who gave back. And in a sense, he was an early ecologist because he was careful how he handled the land, that he didn't abuse it and exploit it.
Jack studied books on agriculture, consulted expert plant breeder Luther Burbank, and employed new methods in working the land. He built the first concrete silo in California, designed a unique piggery later called the Pig Palace, and raised champion bulls and horses.
London always wanted, and he wanted big, and the best of things. In other words, he went to get his stallions, he got an imported stallion. He didn't go out and get an ordinary stallion or a purebred stallion. The same with his bulls. He always looked for something of quality.
But Jack's biggest project, and perhaps the one he was most proud of, was the construction of Wolf House, a large home where he and Charmian could live and entertain their many visitors.
The notion of having a place where all these people that were intellectuals and artists and so on could have a place to be and to meet and to gather was central in the way that that building was constructed.
Construction on the Mammoth House began in 1911 and would take more than 2 years to complete. It was built using local redwood lumber and volcanic stones. Jack wanted the house to enhance and blend into the landscape. But with costly projects like the Wolf House, Jack was constantly in debt. He was forced to write. His stories provided his only source of income.
He supported his mother. He supported his first wife, Bess, the two girls, my grandmother, Joan and Becky, her sister. He supported his stepsister, Eliza, who was his ranch manager, and a number of families that lived up there in Glen Ellen on the ranch.
I think even for the workers that he had on here, if any of their children got into college, he paid their tuition, and he was really using his land as a way to have things go the way he thought they should.
The Beauty Ranch was Jack's private utopia. He could swim and ride horses in his own backyard, but he also could enjoy the solitude of writing.
And you look at his den, you notice there are just two little windows way up high, and the desk faced the wall. Yeah, the windows around back, but he just faced the wall and had a writing table. So there wasn't anything that could distract his thinking.
On the ranch, there was a rule. He would invite just about anyone to come up there, but no one could disturb him in the morning with the writing time. After lunch, it was time to do other things, to entertain his guests.
Jack entertained friends from all walks of life, hobos, ex-convicts, artists. But the two visitors he wanted to see the most hardly ever made it to the ranch.
After the divorce, Bess was very, devastated, angry, and she was extremely jealous of Charmian and generally would not allow the girls to visit the ranch if Charmian were there.
On June 19, 1910, Charmian gave birth to Jack's third daughter, Joy London. The delivery was complicated. The baby died 2 days later.
And Jack was absent that whole time. That must have been tremendously hurtful to Charmian. I can only imagine the loneliness and the despair and the sadness that she felt that he didn't rush home to be with her. But perhaps he simply couldn't face that loss directly.
At that point, or sometime soon after that, he really tried even harder to have a more positive relationship with the two daughters, realizing that was it. Those were his heirs.
In 1913, Jack wrote John Barleycorn, an alcoholic memoir, a semi-autobiographical novel.
He wrote John Barleycorn for Prohibition, and so he would actually feel that bad. I mean, you drink, you have a hangover, you can't produce. Well, he just wrote the way he felt.
Now, whether he was an alcoholic or not, I couldn't guess. People have opinions one way or the other. We do know that he drank heavily. And as you read John Barleycorn, in which there is denial after denial of a liking for alcohol, you do have to wonder if it isn't protesting a bit too much.
I am a fact. My drinking is a fact. My drinking is a thing that has happened and is no theory, no speculation. And as I see it, it but lays the emphasis on the power of John Barleycorn. A savagery that we still permit to exist, a deadly institution that lingers from the mad old brutal days and that takes its heavy toll of youth and strength and high spirit and of very much of all of the best we breed.
John Barleycorn was a bestseller and brought Jack London much-needed royalties to complete his dream home. But Jack was about to face a heartbreaking tragedy. On August 22, 1913, weeks before Jack London was scheduled to move in, his indestructible wolf house caught on fire and burned. Oily rags and wood finished with linseed oil spontaneously combusted and set the house ablaze. While Jack was heartbroken, he was not one to dwell upon his losses. Only a lack of money kept him from rebuilding immediately. He drew strength from his constant companion.
Dearest my woman, I am going to live for 100 years because I want to. But I want to die at the last, with my head on your breast, your arms about me, my arms about you. Your mate man.
Charmian and Jack refer to each other as mate or mate woman or twin brother. They had these names that indicated some kind of equivalency or equality, although, of course, he was ultimately in charge. And she happily allowed that for most of their marriage.
But Jack found his mate in Charmian, someone who was willing to go off on his adventures, who was completely supportive and devoted herself to furthering his career and his way of life.
Though they loved their home in Sonoma County, the Londons spent very little time there. Since their return from the Snark voyage, Jack and Charmian had been on a horse trip to Oregon, a train trip across the country, sailed around Cape Horn, and taken numerous short sailing trips around Northern California. In 1914, they sailed to Veracruz for Jack's assignment to report on the Mexican Revolution.
But I do think that he had more determination to live that adventurous life. He really did. That was a big thrill in his life. It fed him. He needed that in his soul as much as he needed to write. He needed to write, and he needed to live that full life.
Jack was not the Superman that sometimes his own fiction, perhaps even his own nonfiction, would lead us to believe. If you study his medical history, you find that he was sick a lot of times.
Jack suffered from constant toothaches, painful joints, severe headaches, bronchitis, and pleurisy. He also had recurring bouts of malarial fever contracted in the South Seas, and later developed kidney disease.
He was frustrated that his illnesses sometimes affected his mind. Not that he was going crazy or anything, but he sometimes hurt so much that he couldn't create.
I would say really that the interesting thing is that despite a number of difficulties, especially health-wise, that he wrote some of his very best work in the last couple of years of his life.
In 1915 and 1916, Jack and Charmian returned to Hawaii. They spent half of each year on the islands in the hopes that the leisurely pace and mild climate would benefit Jack's health. During his stay, he wrote a number of short stories incorporating Hawaiian people and culture.
When I was younger, I muddled my poor head over queerer religions, old Kahokomo retorted. But listen, O young wise one, to my elderly wisdom. This I know. As I grow old, I seek less for the truth from without me and find more of the truth from within me. Why have I thought this thought of my return to my mother and of my rebirth from my mother into the sun? You do not know. I do not know. save that without whisper of man's voice or printed word, without prompting from otherwhere, this thought has arisen from within me, from the deeps of me that are as deep as the sea.
Upon his return from the Klondike in 1898, Jack London weighed a trim 165 pounds. By age 39, he weighed more than 200 pounds. He chain-smoked unfiltered cigarettes, and to Charmian's growing concern, exercised less and less.
And in the last year of his life, he was quite ill and was under the care of a doctor and was administering morphine to himself for pain and other drugs. And that can't have been happy.
On November 21st, 1916, Jack London wrote a few letters and went to bed complaining of indigestion. The next morning, he could not be roused. Charmian and his stepsister Eliza tried their best to revive him.
She and Eliza walked him up and down the hallway, and his right side face was all drooped and his right leg dragged. Well, he had a stroke. They didn't know too much about strokes in those days.
Jack London died on November 22nd, 1916, at the age of 40. The cause of death was listed as kidney poisoning, though many now believe that he suffered a fatal stroke. 4 days after his death, Jack London's ashes were buried on his ranch in Glen Ellen. A volcanic rock too large to use in the construction of Wolf House marks the final resting place of one of America's most celebrated and popular writers.
I am firmly and solemnly convinced that the game is worth the candle. I have had a very fortunate life. I have been luckier than many hundreds of millions of men in my generation have been lucky, and while I have suffered much, I have lived much, seen much, and felt much that has been denied to the average man. Yes, indeed, the game is worth the candle.